are. Sorry about that. But so we needed a little bit of time to get things just oriented correctly as we get going today. All right, so hey, welcome, and I'm glad you're here. And we're going to get started here in just a moment. We'll give folks a second to catch up with us because we're since my timing was off a little bit there. Had to make sure that we were set up to go live correctly on YouTube and all that tonight. So, hope you're doing well. Hey, come on in. Come on into our class tonight, and let's get ready to have some conversation about this next phase of church history, which is very, very important, and we're getting closer to home as we talk about some of these things. So as we talk tonight about the English Reformation, we're really starting to get pretty to some stuff that's pretty close to our heritage in the churches of Christ, and certainly some stuff that we can find some relevance for. So it's a little bit different tonight. Rylan is not going to be joining us because he has a youth group gathering at their house tonight, and so my girls are over there. I'm glad that they're able to do that tonight over at the Cox's house. But so we're flying solo, and actually we have a lot of material for you today. We want to move through some things that are have some significance. So I hope it hopefully be useful to you. I don't know. This may be a little bit more for your your some of you pure history nuts. I know that some of you guys really get into some of this stuff, and probably for some of this may feel a little bit more familiar to you, but I'm not sure how much of it you may have studied in terms of a religious context, and seen some of the implications for like how we got to where we are, and also how we understand ourselves a little bit too. But there's certainly a lot of that. So we've been talking in these moments of church history. We have been working towards working the last two meetings that we've had, the last two classes we've had. We've been talking about the Reformation, okay, which happens in the 16th century, the 1500s. It really begins with Luther in Germany, 1517. Okay, but just a few years later, we have similar movements in Switzerland. We have movements like in Holland as well, in the Netherlands, and then we have a different kind of movement in England, and so we want to talk about that a little bit. And we've said along the way a little bit how sometimes these Reformation movements were pretty political in nature. Okay, they're very much tied with the entities that are ruling, the monarchs or the princes or whoever has power in the region where they're located. All right, hey, we've got what a good crew. We got the Jacksons and Betty and Brent and Nyla. Man, Dana, good to see you guys. Bobby and Rhonda and Dave and Celia too. What a great group. So as we move into, we've kind of glanced off some of the political implications of some of the things that happened in the Reformation. But when we come to the English Reformation, it is very much an important part of the story, an unavoidable part of the story. And we can kind of see some of the dynamics at work a little clearer. So I'm actually going to switch today to a presentation mode, if I can get this to work correctly. And I'm going to kind of walk through some information in that way. I think I've got it set so my head will kind of show up in the corner. Let's see if this works correctly. All right, and let's push. Oh man, I gotta get this out of the way a little bit, and keep covering the button that I need to push to make it go forward. Okay, all right, so you guys can still see me here, and then we can kind of see some of this. I said that. I'm gonna get that microphone monitor off my screen. Okay. We can see some of this information now and how it plays out. All right, so when we talk about the Reformation, we're going to talk about two kings and two queens, a pair of kings and a pair of queens, and we're going to talk about a book. too, and that's a good way. That's just kind of a little shorthand for you about how to understand the process of the English Reformation. You got two kings, two queens, and a book. That's what you need to know about to really grasp the center of what's happening in the 16th century in terms of the Reformation in England. Because it all really revolves around one dude, and his name is Henry VIII. And if I hear you singing little Henry VIII, I am out there, then that's fine, because we want to we really to come to an understanding of the English Reformation. We really have to start and end with Henry. And Henry is a pretty interesting cat. Okay, he is by all accounts a very charismatic dude. He is a very well-loved leader in England at his time, and he has he has enough popularity to kind of get away with some of the things that create the English Reformation. He has some power. Now, he has, just as a leader, as a political leader, he has some failings too. He's lavish and spends a ton of money. Okay, much of it on this failed series of wars, like where he's trying to either gain more influence or territory, or trying to push against other world leaders, whether that be the Holy Roman Empire, Charles over there, or whether it's sorry about that. Yeah, that mute button is a little too close for comfort. Is that better? Hopefully that's better. The Now I gotta wait and make sure that it comes back for you. I think it is. Somebody tell me when it's back. It's back. I know you can hear me now. You gotta be able to hear me now, right? Let's make sure. I'm glad I kept those comments on my screen. Okay, good. All right, now I got a little lag between when I see your guys' comments come in. All right. Oh, there you go. Very good. Thanks, guys. Okay. All right. So Henry VIII, main challenge is to make sure that he has a male heir, a prince who will easily succeed him on the throne, and who will kind of be able to create the foundation of a dynasty for him. And this is the House of Tudor. Okay, these are the Tudors that we're talking about. Henry's first wife, and the importance of the word first in that sentence cannot be underestimated. His first wife is Catherine of Aragon. And Henry is in many ways an interesting, charismatic figure. Catherine, I think, is what we would have to say. We would have to characterize her as a tragic figure, because of the way that her life turns with Henry. Because if Henry's main concern is to have a male heir, then his main use of his queen is indeed to produce that heir. And when she cannot, that creates all kinds of problems, right? So here's the story with Catherine. She actually has 6 children. Okay, but of her 6 children, she starts off with 5 babies who are either stillborn. 3 of them are stillborn, and 2 of them die within a couple of months of being born, including there are a couple of boys in the middle of those 5. And I want you to just kind of hold on to this before we move on. Like she is going to have a baby girl as well. I want you to just kind of sit a little bit with the grief of Catherine of Aragon, because in addition to these 5 pregnancies, she has at least a couple more miscarriages, we think. Okay, we're not really sure the number of those, but we think she maybe has, in the span of a decade, 9 pregnancies that fail, and or 8 of them that fail, and she's really increasingly threatened because of that. Okay, so much so that Henry very much begins exploring the what it will mean for him to have his marriage with Catherine annulled, and this is what ends up triggering his real interest in the Reformation, because the conflict that begins with him is with the Pope, who is going to exercise his papal authority in refusing to grant him a an annulment or a divorce with or the right to move on from Catherine of Aragon. And Henry asserts that it is his right to do so. The Catholic powers there are refusing to allow that. And that, for a couple of years, results in a stalemate. Now, do have this one baby girl, Mary, but that's not enough just to predictably sustain the dynasty of Henry. And so he fears that another male from another one of the lines of will end up taking the throne ahead of Mary, right? And there's no real resolution to that. Okay, and so he eventually works it out with an archbishop there, a church leader that we're going to talk about in just a few moments, because of this problem with no male heirs, Catherine is divorced and is out the door. Okay, and that happens in 1533. And so this, like we talked about these other kind of marker dates about when we can say the Reformation begins in these certain areas. 1533 is one of the possible dates that we could use to mark the English Reformation, because when he puts aside Catherine against the authority of the Pope, he is very much rejecting the Pope, and he is claiming at the time that he has, as the regent, as the king of England, that he has the sole power over the churches during that time. Now, that line of thought goes back a long way, right? And it's been building since Constantine, that the emperors or kings or in various places have been asserting more or less influence on what happens in the church. But there's always been that tension between the church powers, the ecclesial powers, and the powers of the state. But Henry, in his definitive break with the Church of England, the Catholic Church rather, in creating the Church of England, is whether or not he has the authority on this matter of this religious matter of his divorce. And it's interesting that in this moment that marriage is seen as primarily a religious matter, right? That was something under the domain of the church. And so it's not that he says, as the domain of the state, I have the right for this divorce. Rather, he says, because I'm the ruler of this nation, I therefore am ruler of the church as well, and therefore have power over this religious matter, which is my marriage, right? I have the authority to do this. In putting aside Catherine, he takes his second wife, whose name is Anne Boleyn. And Anne actually was a member of Catherine's court. She was one of the handmaids of Catherine, so she's somebody that's there in the court and is around. And they are actually, secretly married before the annulment of Henry and Catherine can officially take place. It's there's the transition between these two queens is pretty fluid. Okay, But there in 1533, we have Anne Boleyn coming on the scene, and Anne, the relationship between Henry and Anne is itself going to be somewhat fraught with peril. Okay, because Anne herself is gives birth to a single child, a daughter, again. So, which means that Henry still does not have the male heir that he desires. He says that he loves his daughter Elizabeth. Okay, but he here again recognizes that he's in a pickle, and he is not sure this time. And instead of going the route of having this marriage annulled, he doesn't feel like he can get away with that again. Okay, he's kind of already pulled that trick. And so Henry does something that he does with several of his subjects, is he has Anne accused of treason, and she too is going to get the axe in 1536. Now, I don't think any real historian believes that she was really treasonous, except for in the failure to have a baby boy, and in doing so, she's that's really the offense against Henry. Now we can say here, like, well, man, the king's way out of line, right? The king's way out of line. He is out of line. I mean, let's just say that. He's abusing his authority. But he's also, what's the value behind what he's chasing here? He's not really, although he does have this kind of image as a lustful playboy. Okay, Henry's. It's not really about the women; it's about the child, and in being about the child, it's really about the stability of the throne. In this age, we're in an age where when there's a dispute, and we can see this with some of his descendants later, when there's a dispute about who really is in line for the kingdom, for the throne, that's dangerous. And it's very easy for that to slip into dissension and violence, violence that fractures the kingdom. And that's a real threat. Okay, who like peaceful line of succession is a big thing, right? And that's really what Henry's goal is. Okay, it's also the pride of being a monarch whose dynasty is founded too. And so, in chasing his pride, his hubris, and in chasing the stability, also something that by divine right is seen as the stability of the empire, the stability of his kingdom. He's on this pursuit, and logically, if you're with him on board of, like, it's dangerous for there not to be a son, right? The kingdom is in jeopardy until the stability and the peace of the kingdom are in jeopardy until we know there's a male heir on the throne. Until we get to that place, there's a lot of danger here. Okay, so Henry, once he logically has that in his mind, he can't stop, right? He kind of has to find ways to follow this through, and all his court intrigues here are aligned towards that. After Anne, okay, we get a woman named Jane Seymour, and Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, is the one that eventually will provide him with this, what he's been seeking for so long, this male heir named Edward. Okay, and so this series of this king and his pursuit of this royal power is a significant storyline, because if you think about it, within these 5 years, okay, 6 years, the pursuit of the kingdom of England has led to this break with the church in Rome. And in Seymour eventually, she dies. Actually, I should have said that. This is the tragic part of the story. Is after she has Edward, she dies because of that. Because of the childbirth, she dies shortly after, and so that's the real tragic story, right? He finally gets his heir, but then he's also heartbroken because of his love for this woman that Now, here's the deal, right? So Henry is actually going to, for various reasons after that, after Jane dies, he's actually going to have 3 more wives after that. And we could just continue to tell that story, but that's not exactly what we're interested in here, or not as much interested in, just his romantic exploits for the sake of themselves, even though that's certainly very, very interesting reading. We're interested in the story that it tells because of the Reformation, right? And so these first 3 wives, the ones on the top row, the one that we've just mentioned, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and then Jane Seymour, are the 3 that really play out they're really key to the story of the Reformation. Because what's going to happen after that? Because each of these 3, okay, has yielded a child, okay, and so Catherine's daughter Mary, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, and Jane's daughter, or James' son, Edward. All 3 of these are going to be successors to the throne of Henry VIII. Okay. Now it's actually remember, his fear was that these women would not be able to take the throne. Well, his last wife was successful in making sure that laws were passed so that even his daughters would be able to take the throne. Well, because of this, okay, but here's the story, right? We got these 3, and I think I've got this animated correctly. Okay, so we're going to change the order, because what happens is when Henry dies, his son Edward is going to take the throne. Okay, and then we have a very short-lived battle. There's another woman that claims to be the queen for like 10 days, and then we have Mary, his firstborn daughter, and then we have Elizabeth, his second-born daughter. They're going to take the throne after in their turn after Edward. Okay, so what we end up with is this line of succession. Okay. And this is a very, very important for not just it's important because the way that these 4 monarchs rule really sets the stage for how the Reformation in England is not just going to start. It just starts with Henry, okay, but the solidification of it is very, very, very significant. Okay, of these 4 monarchs, okay, Mary actually is under Queen Mary, the kingdom reverts to Catholicism. Okay, and if you think about that for just a second, it's kind of part of the reason we told the story that we just have about the wives of Henry VIII. Why? It's not difficult to see why she does that, right? Because remember, who is Mary? Well, she's the daughter of Henry's first wife, right? The one who was married to him as a Catholic, and who was eventually discarded, and that's what the Reformation was born out of, right? Yeah, her mother's Catholic, and not only is her mother Catholic, Jordan, but like her mother is discarded, and it's the people of the Reformation that make that possible, right? Think about how personal the Reformation is for Mary. In fact, through the rest of of Catherine's life, okay. Now, Catherine isn't executed; she's not executed like Anne Boleyn is. Instead, what happens with Catherine is she's basically exiled, and one of the conditions of her exile is that she's not allowed to see her daughter, and her daughter is not allowed to see her. Now, they exchange some letters, even though they're not really supposed to do that, but they have this relationship, and Anne or Mary rather, grows up really regarding her mother, Catholic mother, as, first of all, being discarded and jilted, okay, but also as she has a lot of idealization of her as a faithful person, and her Catholicism is really tied into that. Like Catherine, when she goes into exile, she lives essentially in like Franciscan poverty, okay, and and that's a really important part of this story. Is that when Henry moves away from Catholicism and moves away from his wife at the same time, there was this little girl. There was this little girl that was growing up watching that and saying, "Well, how's this working out?" And her mother still being a person of very much practicing faith. Her father seems to be on this other pursuit, and so Mary really kind of grows into this. It is to me significantly ironic that Henry's whole pursuit was because of he was seeking to have this male heir. Well, his female heirs, his female daughters, are the ones that are going to end up taking his legacy. Okay, and end up being very, very powerful women, very, very powerful women. And in England in the late 1600s. Okay, and they are they very much rule with strength. But Mary and Elizabeth both. Okay, um, with this storyline though, we need to kind of back up a little bit. Okay, so we said right that we're going to start off. We're going to have the story of the English Reformation is a story of two kings, a pair of kings and a pair of queens. And also a book. So this is the lay of the land of the monarchs who are part of this story. But to really catch on to what happens, to really catch on to what happens in this story, we need to pick up with another character, okay? And that's about a guy named Thomas Cranmer. Now, Thomas Cranmer is a very important figure in the Anglican Reformation. Both because of what he makes possible and because of a legacy that he leaves. And really want to understand that in terms of this thing that he writes called the Book of Common Prayer. Let me back up a little second here. Okay. No, we'll go back. I'm sorry. All right. I've put him here between Henry and Edward because he plays a significant role during both of their reigns. Okay, now during Henry's reign, Cranmer had actually worked as an ambassador over in the Holy Roman Empire, in territories of that, and so he has a lot of contact actually with German folks, and he begins to be influenced very much so by some. Now he's still a Catholic. Cranmer is still a Catholic. He also takes the step. He's a priest. He ends up getting married. Okay, he had some roles in the Catholic Church, and he ends up taking a wife, which shows some of the influence of some of these other reformers. Okay, and when Henry is on deciding that he needs to move away from Catholicism, he finds in Thomas an English cleric who he believes will be an ally in separating from the Church of Rome. And Thomas has begun to develop some very significant theological ideas, like about justification by faith, okay, and ideas about the nature of communion, or ideas about the nature of Scripture and the importance of Scripture, and things that he's really getting from these reformers on the continent in Europe during his stays over there. He's recalled back to and pronounced to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay, he's the Archbishop in charge of England, more or less. And as such, Henry elevates him to a position. He elevates his ally because, and then Thomas is really the one who is given the charge about whether, now that Henry has stated that he has the authority to do this, he's the one that really blesses Henry's putting away of Catherine of Aragon and taking Anne Boleyn as his wife. So Thomas, in doing that, Thomas Cranmer, in doing that, really solidifies the moment of the English Reformation. Okay, after Henry's death, he continues to serve under Edward, and Edward basically allows Thomas to be the theologian driving this new Reformation movement. Okay, and Thomas is that really brings us to Thomas's main vehicle for doing that, which is the Book of Common Prayer. During the reign of Edward, and 19 or in sorry 1549, he releases the first version of the Book of Common Prayer. It's released pretty quickly, and then it goes through. And 3 years later, it has a fairly significant revision in that second volume that comes out in 1552. It would be difficult to overstate the importance of this. Kramer's book is essentially a full manual for how to do worship. Okay, so if you've ever thumbed through a Book of Common Prayer, and you can easily get one at your local Episcopal church or any kind of Anglican communion church, the Book of Common Prayer contains a script for worship. Okay, and it has different scripts for different times of the year. It has for different kinds of services like baptisms and funerals and things like the weddings, and it tells you, it kind of is the flow of worship for all those different things, right? In addition to having daily prayer, morning prayer, nightly prayer, it really is like the Book of Common Prayer is essentially a manual for how to have worship. Okay, and Kramer, in writing it, took this book, and which is going to be read verbatim in the churches, right? It's the kind of thing that in this kind of high liturgy services, the priest who's conducting worship is going to read the prayer for that morning, and is going to then read the scriptures for that day, and then is going to kind of work through the schedule that's in the book. Well, Cranmer realized that was an incredible tool. And in fact, for the structure of the way that the church was in England, that was the best tool to advance his theological agenda. And if you think about that, that actually makes a lot of sense, right? If you're the reformers in the other cities, we said that like the main tool that the Reformation had, right, was its publishing writings. Okay. Well, one of the problems with that is that even though Gutenberg had made it very possible for written materials to be disseminated widely, it's still a pretty elite task, right? Like, how many people in the mid 1500s really, I mean, when you really think about this, like, how many people who are non-clergy were going to pick up, somehow get a copy of a book of Martin Luther's, and read all this theological writings about, Romans or Galatians or whatever, right? Yes, it's very influential among clergy. It's very influential among theologians. But how influential is it really for like your common folk? Well, it kind of has to disseminate, right? Like, it has to be somebody. And we talked about the second tool. So the writings are how this theology like spreads across the land. But the second tool is through preaching. And these famous Reformation preachers, like Huldrych Zwingli or John Calvin, or Martin Luther, and some of his associates there, in the places where they are, that those sermons are going to become very powerful tools, right? Well, but what about the parish down the street that doesn't have a Martin Luther or Huldrych Zwingli, or doesn't have a John Calvin, right? Well, the Reformation's theology spreads to those as the clerics read their writings and priests read their writings and things like that, but it still is a pretty loose way of doing it, right? Like, the theology still has to spread as the preachers in those local places actually craft sermons that take that theology into account. Cranmer's work was worked on a much more fundamental level, and in some ways a slower level, because it wasn't as direct as a sermon that strikes you, that is meant to teach you the difference of this Reformation principle as opposed to the Catholic principle that you were taught before. It's just not as direct as that. But think about the effect over years and years of what people are praying through. And Cranmer decided that his best tactic for changing the way people thought and believed and felt about God was by influencing the things that they prayed and sang and worshiped. It's pretty significant. Pretty significant that he took his approach. Now, like I said, the second version of this comes out in 1552. Unfortunately, if you are keeping track here, okay, 1552, well, good old Mary, who we also know as Bloody Mary, comes to the throne in 1553. So that 1552 volume didn't get a whole lot of work, right? Because when Catholic Queen Mary rises to the throne and begins to, she immediately reverts the church back to the practices of Catholicism, including practices of worship. Cranmer's liturgy is out the door, right? And not just is his, that's actually the least of his problems at that point, because she is looking at him and saying, hey, you know, when my mama and my daddy, when my daddy was getting ready to put my mom away, I remember that you're the guy that signed all the paperwork, right? And she sees him as the person that is advancing all of these, not just that personal vendetta, but all these heresies. And so she sets her mind to have him executed. He actually recants. He actually has a moment. Thomas Cranmer is a fascinating dude, guys. And when he is sentenced and to be burned, to be executed, he is like, he has the opportunity to recant, and he does that, and he rejects his Reformation teachings, his Protestant teachings, and he attempts to embrace Catholicism again. Normally, that would have earned him a reprieve. That would have been the law, would be for him to be receive a reprieve at that point. But Mary is very much bent on the personal symbol of Thomas Cranmer needs to die. He's been the architect of, he's not just been a side character, he's really been the architect of the Reformation there, of the Protestantism in England at this point for the last 20 years. And she basically becomes hard fast that he's going to die even if he recants. He is given one last opportunity to preach, and he writes a speech that is submitted that he in this university church there, that he is going to before he goes to his death, he's making peace with God and the Catholics and reconciling to his Catholicism. Except for he does not read the prepared speech that he had written and that he had submitted a copy. It kind of reminds me of like sometimes, you know, you're a valedictorian at the school will like submit the written speech that they're supposed to give, and sometimes they kind of go off script. Well, Cranmer goes off script, and instead of, you know, his repentant sermon confession that he was intended to do, he basically ends his sermon or transitions in his sermon, and he says very clearly that the Pope is the enemy of Christ and is the Antichrist. His the Catholic Watcher honors there were not very impressed with Cranmer saying that. He essentially recants his recantation. In fact, he says, "My hand with which I signed my recantations." He basically says, "Woe to this hand! And when I go to the fire, I go willingly, and my hand that wrote the recantations will go to the fire first." And when they light the fire, he reaches towards it with his writing hand and says, you know, basically, this is the hand. This hand needs to burn before the rest of me because of the way it recanted its true beliefs, or tried to do that, and attempted to do that anyways. So Cranmer is executed. Now later, after Anne, there's a guy named John Foxe. I'm sure many of you guys have heard about. He wrote a book called Foxe's Book of Martyrs, and he's an English person. He's writing about many of the people that are persecuted under Queen Mary. He's actually writing from exile. I think he's in France. I think that's right. He's running from France in safety, or not? No, I guess it wasn't France. That would not have been a real safe place to be. He's somewhere in Europe in a Protestant, probably England or probably a Germany or Switzerland, and he basically canonizes Thomas Cranmer as a martyred saint under Queen Mary. After Mary, Queen Elizabeth is going to return the country back towards Protestantism, okay, and towards the Anglicanism of Henry and Edward and Cranmer, and there will, I believe, there is one last. I'm pretty sure I'm saying this correctly. Like about 100 years later, there's going to be one last Catholic monarch, but that's very different. King James II. But after Elizabeth, essentially the line of succession of the throne is going to be largely following the Anglican way. Okay. When we talk about the Anglican Reformation, okay, there are two main things that are at stake here, and that I think really come through very clearly. And the first one is authority. It really is about a rejection of papal authority over people in sovereign England. Now, it very much takes the form of the authority of the king, so it is a state authority. This is not yet, and it would be about 150 years before there are really people that make a permanent case. It's kind of in the age of like John Locke and some of those other folks. Before there's really a permanent case to say there should be toleration of other forms of religious experience. Now, after Queen Elizabeth, we have King James, okay? And James does the first, like the King James Bible, right? He does promote some level of tolerance, okay? But it's not really until a good bit later that Elizabeth had some of this too. But anyway, we're not there yet, right? At this point, the Reformation is about trading the authority of the Pope and of the Catholic seat in Rome, that there's this kind of global authority for the local authority of the monarch in that place. It's an argument for the localization of the church. It's more than that. It's an argument for the authority of the monarch. Beyond that, okay, I think the other real point that comes through when we think about the English Reformation is this idea of liturgy. And what it meant, when we say liturgy, that's like the order of worship, okay? That's maybe the language that we would probably use a little bit more comfortably in our tradition, okay? Let's see if I can get us back to pull off this. And the importance of liturgy in the Reformation here is simply a point that the way we worship matters. And Cranmer very much understood that you can take the way that people worship, and it's a shortcut. Shortcut's not really the right word. How about this? Changing the way that people think is very, very difficult. It's difficult to persuade somebody. But if you can change the way that the vocabulary of our worship, over time, those things will shape the way we believe. We tend to think, all right, and this is maybe even particularly true in our fellowship. We tend to think that the way we come to what happens in worship is that we study and we analyze what worship is, and then we make decisions about the worship that we're going to do, and then our worship is kind of the fruit of that. Cranmer is really working on something that's kind of the opposite side of that story, and it's something that we really need to respect, and that is that sometimes it works the other way around. It's not that our beliefs shape our worship; it's also that our worship shapes our beliefs. There's a phrase, a Latin phrase that was around since the time of Augustine, close to the time of Augustine, and it's called lex orandi, lex credendi. Okay, the law of prayer is the law of belief, and the way that's kind of been taken to mean in different times, in the church, church history, is just a point towards the reality that what we pray, how we worship, becomes the way that we believe. And through history, that really bears out, right? Like um, before there were like the Nicene creeds, there were the things that they said about God in worship, and the creed is kind of a distillation of the liturgy. It's kind of a distillation of uh, the sorts of prayers that they said. So when they would pray to the Father and the Spirit and the Son, that kind of shapes having what would eventually become the creed, or the way that one of the criteria when they're thinking about canon was which books are read publicly in worship in the churches around the world. What in other words, before they could even make the decision about which books belonged in scripture, they observed which books had found their way into worship, and they trusted that was evidence of the Spirit's word, right? This is a really provocative thought in our day and age, I think, right? Because I'll say it's very true to my thing. Like, I think some of the things that are embedded into our songs um, are our most deeply held beliefs. Maybe in some ways, because the things that we sing about are just as close to our heart, if not closer, than some of the things that we actually read in Scripture, or that maybe we should say it this way: there are some things that we hold with more emotional conviction, not just because of the way that they were part of our Scripture study, but because they were part of our worship history. And the things that are part of our worship history are very significant in forming the things that we actually believe. There's certain things about Kramer's life like that kind of drive me nuts. I mean, he seems like he's playing in the political game much more than I'm comfortable with. His kind of flip flopping at the end about whether he was going to recant or not, whether it is going to do any good. I don't know about all that. It's hard to say. He's a hard character to appraise, but I'll say this: when he decided that the best way to solidify a Reformation theology in the people of England was by shaping the way that the people prayed, I think he's onto something there. And I think the more attentive we are to this kind of dynamic, this dialectic really is what it really means, this kind of conversation between what we believe and how we worship and what we pray, and letting those things kind of talk with each other, right? Letting our worship be influenced by our beliefs, and letting our beliefs be influenced by our worship. The kind of back and forth of that. I think that's something to keep our eye on. I think we need to be attentive to that and be as intentional as we can. And when we find places that our theology or our practice, like if we find that there are things that are hard to put into practice about our faith, maybe our love for our enemies, or our beliefs about our being free from anxiety, okay? One of the best things that we can do is not just study those truths more, significant, but maybe one of the best things that we can do are find ways of wrapping those missing pieces of our theology and our practice, finding ways of wrapping them into our prayers and into our worship and into our hymns, into our songs, and that kind of stuff. I think that's a pretty important way of influencing who we're actually becoming. Okay. All right. Well, guys, that sets us up for the Anglican Reformation. We will begin next week, moving a little bit closer to our home where we live, the Churches of Christ, as we talk about those movements, kind of in between the 1530s and kind of towards the very opening stages of what we call the Restoration movement, which is our particular heritage. Okay. And we will move towards that next week. I cannot wait to do that with you. And so I hopefully tonight you hopefully learned something tonight. Hope you enjoyed what we've done tonight. But we will catch you next week, and we'll begin doing some of this restoration stuff. Okay. All right. Peace.